Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Gene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and super excited about today's guest. Our guest today is an accomplished communicator, presenter, and strategist, skilled in building and strengthening relationships in her organization to drive cohesive and effective operations. She's incredibly accomplished with a very long list of degrees and certifications, which we're going to explore a little bit throughout our conversation today. She's currently the Learning and Change Manager for BNSF Logistics. Please welcome Sarah Lang. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for being here. And as we always do, we're going to start with the same question. What do you think is the biggest challenge you see facing the deskless workforce today?
Well, in today's workforce, I've just noticed that there's all kinds of apps, all kinds of websites, all kinds of just information out there in the world, and it's hard to figure out what to focus on. And what matters in your role, and how to navigate just through all of those things on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that always just really gets me in the goat is that these deskless people need direction. Not saying that they're not smart or whatever, but like just tell them what they need to do their job so that they can do it quickly. Everything is so fast-paced right now too, that you just have to get to the right thing in time. And if you can make that easier for them, I just think everyone would be happier and the world would be a better place.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're essentially saying cut through the noise, right? And I think
Yes.
I can really imagine the scenarios you were telling that quick, given your answer there. I can see the scenario where they are being bombarded by a lot of change. And I've heard from a lot of other guests on the show where they've been talking about, change saturation and the particular effects it's having on the frontline workforce. And at the end of the day, like you said, they're just saying, tell me what it is you need me to do and let me go do that. and we're probably affecting their ability to be successful a lot by the amount of noise that they're getting.
Yeah, especially with mobile devices and applications. I know like the biggest catchphrase used to be like, there's an app for that. But like, I feel like now when people hear that, they're like, there's another app for that. Same thing. Can we just use this one app? So I think that's probably like present day a challenge, because I know the pandemic kind of reinvigorated mobile device usage and tracking different things. And, whenever you download an app now, it asks you for your location or, all of these different things like permissions, and it can feel a little bit intrusive. And especially for these folks who are in supply chain and transportation, like it can be a little bit too much. And that's a lot of the resistance that we've seen lately, is that, they want to do their job and they want to do great, but they don't want to be overwhelmed and bombarded with like being tracked all the time. So some apps require you to have your GPS on all the time, and they don't like that. And that might seem like a really silly thing to consider when you're looking at a new application or a new service. So as a logistics company, we have our own technology that we use, but then we're also always looking for the next best thing and sourcing like what would be a great app for our carriers and our customers. And you just have to consider that nowadays, that you don't want to be prying into, like, you're not prying, but like you don't want to be like trying to get this information from them if it's not necessary. So that's some of the things that we've gotten a lot of resistance on, and even people wouldn't want to work with us because some of these apps are requiring them to have certain permissions on their phone. And, there might be they might be a mom and pop shop and they're using their personal mobile device. And they're like, I don't want you to know that I'm eating at Chick-fil-A. Like that's not necessary, right? Like, I don't want
Right.
you to see where I'm at all day. Like, I don't want you to be checking up on me. So I think privacy is a big issue or a challenge as well. Like, people are now pushing back on that.
Yeah. I think their concerns are fair in a lot of ways. And then on the other hand, I think, a company that's deploying technology and deploying expensive assets and trying to deliver a quality service to their customers also have a right to know where those assets are. And right. So it's not an easy answer. It's certainly not black and white. I can certainly see both sides of it, but you raise an interesting perspective about how that impacts their ability or maybe willingness to adopt new technology.
Yes. So beforehand, it was all shiny and new and cool, and they were very open to doing it. But now that there's so much of it, we have to consider what are the people who are servicing us. We have to consider that. So before, the customer experience is much more to people in third-party logistics because you're considering, like you said, the people that you're servicing, but then you also have to consider your carrier as a customer. And in third-party logistics, that can be like a hard thing to grasp, that if you're going to be in this particular area of supply chain, that you have more than one customer. You
Right.
have the customer, and then the carrier customer. And there's usually a back and forth of what's more important. Well, they're all important, but at the same time, you have to have both satisfied and happy to work with you in order for you to make it work, in order for you to have a successful business. So that's like a new way of working that I had to adapt myself, is that I'm actually focused on the internal people, but it's much more than that in logistics. It's, you have to consider what is the carrier willing to do and not willing to do. And that can be a really big stopgap. Like, that's actually caused us to like time out on some things that we were trying to bring up in our technology development, especially between looking at a homegrown system and we can control absolutely every single thing versus, we can go out and source a tool that's already out there, because again, there's tons of stuff out there. People are already using it. Do we want to introduce a new app? What's the benefit? The disadvantages, well, if you're going to be sourcing a tool and that's one of their like deal breakers, is you have to allow all GPS access all the time, then that can really be a problem. I mean, it's been a problem in the past, and it's like you're spending all this money and you get down the road and you realize like this isn't, this may not pan out the way you hoped it would. So,
Yeah. You have some unique circumstances in your example too, because it sounds like some of the men and women that you're describing here aren't employees of your company. And that adds a whole different level of consideration for how you deal with that change. So I really want to dig further into that, but I want to table it for a minute, and I want to give our audience an opportunity to understand a little bit more about your background. And I'm serious when I tell you that your list of credentials is so long, your LinkedIn profile, I had to keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. So I'd like you to share with our audience a little bit about your background, both your education, your formal education, university experience, and also some of the certifications that you have that are super relevant to the role that you're doing today. So tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah. So I grew up in the old millennial generation where your parents can tell you can do whatever you want and be successful at it and be a winner all the time.
What were they thinking?
So maybe I took it a bit too far, but I think I went down this path of wanting to be this strong woman, be a doctor or a dentist or, whatever, a scientist. So I went to college for chemistry, and I enjoyed doing it because you're working with different apparatus and different experiments, and it requires you to have like a really a broad skill set to be a scientist. You have to know how to write, you have to know how to do critical thinking, you have to know how to set up an experiment, you have to know how to write about the results, whether they're good or they're bad, and you have to be able to collaborate with people, which I'm going to get to that. The people part is the ironic thing about being in the science world, because everyone thinks about you're a scientist, you're at a bench, you're always by yourself,
in a lab coat,
the weird guy in the corner, in a lab coat, writing stuff down, and late hours. And so I kept pursuing that because I had an opportunity from a professor who let me work in his lab in undergrad, and that's probably more common today than it was back in the early 2000s when I did it. But he really showed me what it's like to be a scientist, and that there is a people component to it. So I was able to take that experience and go to grad school. So my advisor was like, hey, every semester they're like, hey, what are you thinking of doing when you graduate, blah, 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 which is like, now to me that I'm out of it, it's a crazy thing to ask people at that age. But I was like, well, I don't really think I really want to be like a dentist or a pharmacist. Like, I initially was going for pharmacy. I was like, I don't think I want to do that. Like, I don't want to count pills all day and make sure people aren't sending me fake scripts and stuff like that, So I was like, he's like, well, have you considered going to grad school? And I'm like, all right, I'll go to grad school. So that's how a lot of my circumstances have been by chance. But I went to grad school, and it was like the best experience I've ever had. Most people talk about it was a PhD program for chemistry. So again, not something normal for women at my point in time. But I was like, okay, I'm gonna go, but I'm probably gonna be like the worst one there. Like, I'm coming from this small college in Louisiana, people barely know about it. Like, yeah, whatever. Like, I'm gonna go and see how far, like, see how if I can survive like the first few weeks. Okay. So I get there, and again, I had the most amazing research advisor. He was a tough guy. He actually typically only recruited international people in his lab. So I worked with people from Sri Lanka, from China, from Thailand, from Egypt, from India, all different parts of India.
Yeah.
Russia, everywhere. So I was one of the only Americans in that lab.
And this was at Texas A&M?
Yes.
Okay.
And I do have these science degrees, and people probably look at my background and say like, wow, she has like all this science background, like she doesn't even use it anymore. I use all of it. I use all of it every single day. I have zero regret about that. But I learned really about people in grad school. I didn't learn, yes, I learned science.
Right.
I learned about people and how they learn. People in different countries learn very differently. Some of them are focused on the books. Some of them are focused on the application. And let me tell you, Americans are focused on application. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But it can be a challenge for kids who are coming from all different backgrounds, coming to undergrad. Like, is actually a considerable number of international students that go to A&M for an undergraduate program. So what happened was I discovered that in grad school, I had to teach a laboratory course, and these kids struggled. And I was like, wow, this is kind of crazy to me. Like, this is a really great school. Like, you have to have like a 28 or 30, probably like a 34 at this point on your ACT or whatever. And I'm like, they should really be able to, do this and not be nervous about it. They're like nervous, so you can tell they don't want to be there. Or, like, you're paying to go here, you're getting a scholarship to go here. Like, let's let's get you through this. Let's get you through your next stage of life, you know.
I do want to clarify, the kids that you're referring to were basically just undergrads. They were 4 years younger than you at this time, roughly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure we were all clear on that.
Yeah. So I started looking at how they reacted in the classroom environment and how they reacted in the laboratory environment and how they reacted to the materials that we gave them. And I realized that the laboratory manual, it had a date of 1992, hadn't been revised in that was like 20 years or so. So even the language was different. How you put things on a page is totally different now. If you look at a website from 1994 and you look at a website in 2021, it looks very different, right? So just everything about it, I could tell was a barrier to them getting past the class. And it was really things that I could help with. And it wasn't the content itself, it was how they could grasp the concepts and get through it. And I also learned a lot about how people can learn from each other. So a lot of times in the laboratory course, you had to work alone, and there were very few times where you could work with a lab partner. So there was 1 or 2 times. Sorry, the guy retired, thank God. But if he listens to this podcast, I'm sorry, but I did let people work in partners.
Even though you weren't supposed to.
For some of these hard
Yeah.
Labs, because it was a lot of equipment. It had to be very tedious about how you dropped in the solutions into the vessel, and even how you prepared the little sample to bring it to the other room to get it analyzed. And it just, when you had people to build off of, they could understand each other better, and they could learn from each other, and then they could actually get through the experiment in laboratory time. The lab was 3 hours. Some of them couldn't get through it, so they couldn't get to the end, and they didn't know what the results were and what to make of it. So I really became engrossed in that. And actually all of my students every semester always had higher test scores and higher grades than any other group. So I was like, okay, maybe this is something like I need to explore. And I don't know how much more you want me to talk, because I have more.
Well, you said this, meaning you really found a love for helping people learn is what I'm taking from that. Yeah,
I did. Because then it translated over to, they wanted me to support the graduate students who had to teach. And those were all 95% international people. And then I was able to transfer what I figured out over to them. They had, number one, a language barrier to get through. Number two, again, the lab manual was difficult. Number three, now they're having to communicate with students, making sure they're safe, and all, all these different things that you have to consider when you're not only working in a lab, but teaching a young group of students who have probably never been inside of a lab before, get through an experiment. And then on top of that, what are you supposed to learn from it?
Yeah.
So then I was able to break it down for these international people to be able to teach it. And I have wonderful friends all over the world now. And some of them are now professors, some of them are now working in labs as managers, or they're business managers now. And I just, man, that was worth any dollar I had to pay to be there for a few years. Like it was just meant for me to be there, for me to figure out that, maybe it's not the fact that I'm good at doing experiments, or I'm good at the writing, because I got a lot of coaching from my research advisor on how to write for your audience. That's something I use every single day. But that's really what tips me off into this other world of education.
Yeah. So it looks like when you really started getting into your career, you really went right into a role in training and instructional design. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, that's correct. So I in College Station, there's a bunch of other businesses and they're open to hiring, students. Obviously, they have to be pretty warm and open about that.
Right.
So I found a part-time position at this small company, and they hired me on to do like very basic, testing, go and view this e-learning course, make sure the language is correct, the grammar is correct, make sure nothing's broken, like click on all the buttons and make sure it's working properly. They had a lot of government contracts, so it was, they had certain restrictions and rules on how they built their courses and things like that. So did a lot more like quality control, technical side. And I grew into that e-learning developer role. We had a hard time finding contractors who could use the e-learning tools back at the time. I mean, this is back in 2012 when Articulate was like barely there. Like I went to one of the first, was it e-learning brothers? No, Yukon Learning. I went to one of the first Yukon Learning trainings in Austin, Texas in 2013 to learn about Articulate. And from there, I just said, you know what, I'm just going to try it. I'm going to do it. They paid for me to go. So as we kept working with some of these contractors, I was learning from them as well.
Yeah.
Learning how they use the tool. And from there, I moved into more of that e-learning role. And then I moved into being that instructional designer from analysis all the way to delivery, which is partially why I entered the Purdue program to learn more about like what is all of this like instructional design background, analysis. Like I already did that in the science world with, researching, what kind of experiments I'm going to do, but how does this translate into, the people side and the, educational theories and motivational theories, and how do you assess that someone really knows what they learned, or are they adapting it, are they using it in their role? How do I take that and make sure I'm building tool possible for them to learn from? So that was a wonderful opportunity. I had a great, again, I've just been really lucky with my managers that I've had, because they were able to see that I really wanted to know more and do more and make things right and make things easy for people.
This seems to be a common theme with the podcast guests that we've had, and you represent that well, which is number one, just an absolute passion for what you do. And in this case, it obviously is, very focused on learning, and then just a strong empathy for people and really understanding what they need and looking to make sure that you're doing your best as a professional to serve the needs of your colleagues, your key stakeholders. And so it's exciting to hear you talk about that. I noticed in your current role, then it looks like you had a series of instructional design roles where you were actually building learning content, but you've also now added change management into your role and responsibilities. Tell me a little bit about how that happened.
So a lot of times in my learning role or my instructional design role, you had to understand the audience first in order to figure out what they needed. And a lot of times that training product was for a technology change. It was for a new way of working, a new business process, all of these things that really, they all had this trend of a change that triggered that learning event or that product to be developed. So I always tell people now that I know what change management is, like the formal definition and the pro sci, professional science research behind it, that I've been doing change management for a long time.
Right. Just without the moniker, without calling it
Right.
that. Yeah.
Right. So in Trinity Industries, where I worked, is where my eyes were open to that whole change side with regards to there's a huge, crazy business growth going on. So we have to get people like up and running as quickly as possible. And we have to hire all these people. We have to make sure that they can, be as productive as possible. And within the first 90 days. And, everyone has this, like, we need to get them onboarded within 90 days so that they can really hit the ground running. And so my manager there had this background in it was like medical device documentation. So it was very strict documents that she had to write for the employees to be qualified to perform the task to build the medical device, but then also for a trainer to be qualified to train someone else on using that medical device. So she had a very serious, documentation background and how you are supposed to draw your process maps and how you're supposed to write certain things to make it as clear as possible and that everyone can follow the exact same step. Like it was again, opened my eyes to a new world of, how the world works, I guess, like with
Sure.
medical devices and manufacturing. And so from there, we had to document what was going on, what the business processes were at Trinity Industries. And then from there, build an onboarding program so that whoever was filling these roles knew exactly what they were supposed to do, step by step. What were the impacts to the information they put into the workflow system? Who's receiving it? Why do you have to have this dot here for this job code or repair code or, whatever? Why does the system lock me down if I don't upload this? There was lots of controls too in the rail car manufacturing and repair world. It was highly regulated. So we built that from the ground up, and that was like one of my favorite parts of my career, I think, was I had to sit down and talk with managers and all the roles involved in what do they currently do? What exactly do you do? Even asking that question seems like it should give you a simple answer, but this theme I come across all the time. It's a complicated process to describe something in simple terms. Like it takes a lot of time up front and a lot of conversation and a lot of communication and alignment to like really document in as few words as possible what you're supposed to be doing or how something works. And that's where maybe my science background came in, because I always had to analyze, what is this compound? What are the restrictions? What are the safety issues? What is its possibilities for, mixing it with this other white powder and making it something else, and then because it has to be repeatable, if I want to publish it, how can I write it so that someone in Germany or someone in Canada or someone at, Caltech could repeat it and verify that my experiment is sound and I can put that into a journal. Yeah. So I think that's where that, connection came in. But really, I enjoyed talking to people because we get people in a room. That's the experiment, right? You get the people in the room. They work together every single day. Okay, they work together every single day, but you intentionally get them into a room and say, hey, what is your process for walk me through what happens when a customer comes to you and they need to lease a certain number of rail cars from us. So, sales side or account side starts talking, and then you got the contracts people talking, and then they start coming into conflict because they're like, no, that's not how we do that. No, that's wrong. You should do it this way. You should do it that way. And so then that's my time to come in and say, okay, so knowing that we have to tell people how to do this.
Yeah.
Let's agree. Let's come to an alignment on what the standard is moving forward. And those moments are like the best reward for me personally, because people come to an agreement on how things are going to be streamlined moving forward. And it reduces this conflict. It reduces any question or any doubts moving forward of how something is supposed to work. So they could go back to their offices and be in totally different sides of the building, and they could still be in agreement and alignment and keep things moving smoothly. And that then translates to the customer experience. So the customer, if everything's streamlined internally, the customer is going to hear the same message. The customer is going to have the same experience if they talk to, Sally at contracts, or they talk to somebody else across the building in contracts, or they talk to somebody in finance, or they talk to somebody in the repair side. Well, how do I know what I have to pay to repair this? Why do I have to pay to repair this rail car when you own it? And they understand the contracts, how they work. They can go in and say, well, hey, look, under your contract that you signed, your lease contract, this is what it reads. And they're going to give the same answer every time if you did it right.
So you talked a combination there about some of the how those folks need to do things, but you also touched on something else I'd like to bring back a little bit, which is the why behind a lot of that change. And I think that's really a fundamental thing that's missing in typical digital transformation initiatives, or at least those that don't go so well. And something that I've learned from all of my new friends in that are change management practitioners about just the communication process. So I'm curious to get your take on how you solve for that communication challenge of explaining the why, particularly with frontline workers as it involves digital transformation. What would you recommend folks do to really address that, and how have you done that previously?
Yes. So in the example that I just gave, it was a little bit easier to manage the change because the new people who come in, they don't know what they don't know.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
So they come in knowing they have their 90-day period to, adopt it to the job, or, you might be sent to a different department, or, whatever.
Do they know that they have 90 days? That they have 90 days, but do you communicate that?
Yeah, I knew when I came in, I had a 90-day period.
Okay.
So yeah, you have a 90-day period where they're going to onboard you, and they're going to make sure that you are, you're good to go, you can do the job. Very rarely were people like, oh, you suck, you gotta go.
Right.
But it's like a, hey, FYI, there's technically from HR policy a 90-day period.
Right.
So that maybe that had something to do with it, to make sure that you can do your job correctly and pay attention. But my recommendation, in that situation is, if you have a situation, which typically you do, of seasoned people at your company, middle of the road, 3 or 4 years in, and then you have brand new people and you have a change coming, you really have to sit down and do that change impact for every single role, and then down to that individual level. I know that sounds really time consuming, but I promise there is a benefit. There's a benefit to doing that. There's a reward to doing that due diligence and taking that time to try to unravel everything ahead of deploying that change. So really focusing on the change impact, what might be the points that they're resisting adopting a tool or adopting a new way of working, and what are some tactics to, they're going to come up. So think about, how you can work with that, or how you can start to get them to adopt. The second thing I would say is managers are critical in making the change happen. As far as pro-sci research goes, those are the people who provide you with that certification and put you through that training, and they have all years and years of research based on what is likely to reduce the barrier to change. Who do employees want to hear from when a change is happening? The biggest thing is the biggest impact to an employee at the desk level is to hear from their manager and to get follow-up from their manager and to be able to give feedback to their managers, know that they're being heard, and that if there are, with any change, software updates, there's going to be a glitch, there's going to be an issue, that they can be heard, and that the manager can follow up and take care of those things for them. So basically the manager has their back, but then from a leadership side, the manager has to be bought into the change. So the why, I think, is probably the most important for the manager. Second most important is the employee level, because the manager has to sell it too. They have to be really bought into it. Otherwise, they're going to be like, hey, this change is coming, just FYI, but it's fine. I'm not going to pay attention to it. But just if they ask, let them know that I told you that we're doing this now. Okay.
Right. It's a checking the box exercise at that point. And it's not true full engagement, right?
Right. And so my recommendation from a leadership perspective is to, when you're working with the manager to get their buy-in, you need to be able to show the benefit to them and the benefit to their employee, which to me, most of the time, I can see the benefit of why we're changing certain technology. But it does have a stigma of, oh, well, everything's going to get automated, so my role is going to go away, So getting the why to the manager and get them to buy into that why, and connecting that to the benefit to the employee. How is this going to make it easier for me? Moving forward, what is my day going to look like? How is this going to remove some of the challenges we currently have? And then it would be to break it down. So I don't know if you've heard of this approach, but a crawl, walk, run method.
Sure.
That works for us. That's the method that works particularly where I'm working right now. Other companies they're great with just full send on anything.
Yeah. Somebody I met with the other day used an expression that I hadn't heard before, which was minimum viable proficiency. So we talk about MVP as a minimum viable product, but I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it is, because it's exactly what you just said. With crawl, walk, and run, we don't necessarily need to go from 0 to running pace all at one time. And perhaps the better path for our learners and the users of this new technology would be to have an easier onboarding, right? We don't have to be at 100% proficiency. They don't need to know how to do every single transaction on the first day. And can we actually make this experience better for them and allow them to be successful in increments over time? And will that ultimately lead to better adoption of the overall enterprise system?
Right.
So it sounds like different terminology, but saying something very similar to what you're talking about.
Same concept. And it also aligns really well with agile methodology and technology production. Right. So then they'll get used to that pattern of there's going to be a little bit going on all the time.
Right.
So one of the biggest barriers is just with anything is getting people comfortable with knowing that there will be a little something tweaking going on all the time. So once we saw that where I work now, it's just taken things from like this difficult to just a little bit more, and now they know what to expect. And from a change perspective, have as repeatable of a process as possible. So every single time, if they're the CEO or the VP of ops or whoever is going to come down to them and say, hey, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is what I need you to do, you have that same exact approach every time. It's like kind of like your daily, like it's like a daily schedule. In the morning, gotta have breakfast. Then gotta have lunch. Then you gotta have dinner. It's gonna be like that every time. With the change, this is what we're doing for breakfast. This is what we're doing for lunch. This is what we're doing for dinner.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way for you to describe that, because what I'm hearing from you is we're going to have consistency with change.
Yes.
Right. So it gives a framework so that there are things that are predictable for the people that are on the receiving end of this. And I think that's one of the things that when we think about the men and women in the field and how they are impacted by the technology, initiatives that the organization has, they have been, most of the time, they've not been as in the loop as some of us have been, because they're out doing their job and we're concocting all of these new innovations that we want to bring out to the field. Right. And they tend to feel very uncomfortable about the unknown and what's happening. And so to give them something that's more predictable, even if in your description, it's just that framework for how we're going to communicate, how we're going to release, the consistency that we'll use with these new releases and things like that. That sounds like a really powerful way to bring something that is consistent and predictable to them, even though the underlying environment is going to be changing a little bit over time.
Right. So for example, we, in our kind of like an example of the communication that would be repeatable that I found works is the sponsor announces, if it's depending on how big the change is, sponsor announces, then employee can expect to hear from their manager on what exactly they need to do and when they need to start adapting it. And then the third part is consistently getting a check-in from your manager. How's it going? Until you have reached that success threshold. So I think that person who is talking about that minimum viable proficiency, we all have a hope and dream about this change, okay? But let's be real. Let's talk about what we expect to really happen day-to-day basis moving forward. Like we want everyone to use this tool 100% of the time, but realistically, let's talk about what is good enough for the organization. I know people are probably like cringing at me saying that, but you have to look at things realistically sometimes, because it's people. They're all on a different page. They're all gonna even adapt at a different time. Like some people are early adopters, they doesn't bother them one bit. Other people, like, it's hard. It's gonna take them 3 months to open the new tool.
Right.
It's gonna take some time. So what do you consider that threshold of, okay, we can lay off of that topic. We can let that marinate and keep, we're good with that. And then later on, when we have the other little change coming up, we can reinforce that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, many times the alternative is that we try to cram it all down their throat all the time and we get zero or very little engagement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we instead shift our thinking and say, hey, maybe we can actually ease the burden so that there's not quite so much change all at one time, and earn their trust through them having success with this new system and this new process and things like that. And then we can begin to layer on additional capabilities over time. Ultimately, we're achieving better results than we would have in the other way. So I think, we have to reframe what our expectations are.
Mm-hmm.
And understand that by kind of forcing so much at one time, it's actually counterproductive for them and ultimately counterproductive for the other stakeholders who are really hoping to make this change be successful.
Yeah. So in the science world, how that translates is when you're thinking of an entire experimental design, you have multiple little experiments for that whole project, right? So you work on little bits and pieces at a time. And typically I deal with the low-hanging fruit. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go look at step 3 and make sure that I can get that working really great. And then I'm going to go back to step 1. Like, you don't have to start in the beginning, but you do have to do like kind of like proof of concept, validate, verify, and so that you can get A, B, C, D, and E. You got results for the whole thing. And I think that maybe like subconsciously, that's what I was thinking of, whenever I started doing change management with people, is that, okay, well, we have 5 different steps. Yeah, it may not make sense right now to only focus on number 3, but that's like the least crazy, change in this whole process. So why don't we just focus on that and get a win there and build that trust? That way, when some of the harder, sticky parts come, they're at least going to have that trust that we're going to get through it, we're going to figure it out, and things are going to eventually, smooth over. If you start with the really hard step first, it can be difficult to build that trust,
Yeah.
so kind of how I think of it.
You touched on this earlier, but I'd like to ask you to expand on a little bit, which is how customers, external customers, can sometimes feel the impact of change management gone awry internally. Those are my words. You didn't say it that way, but you were essentially alluding to the impact that change management has on the external customer experience. And I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's really, really important. That it's ultimately, I think sometimes we maybe downplay employee experience and in favor of a bias toward customer experience. But that overlooks the fact that an improved employee experience, which ties to change management, will ultimately probably yield a better customer experience. So I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm completely in agreement with that. Like, everyone talks about take care of your employee and the rest will come. Like, it's true. I think we've had reduced turnover since we started using this repeatable method. We've had people who are more bought in from a management perspective to continue to take some of these changes in stride moving forward. And even some of them have a voice now. They're regularly practicing their voice and bringing issues up to the team to see if and how they can be resolved. But yeah, it all, if the employee is happy with how the process works and they don't have to continue to do all this manual stuff and workarounds to make the customer happy and it's streamlined, then the customer isn't going to feel the pressure, or they're not going to have as many questions asked to them. Like, really simple intentional things, like if you only have to call a customer one time, or say the customer calls you in the logistics world and they say, hey, I've got a load I need you to transport, and it's XYZ product, blah 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 blah, and they have to do that every single day.
Yeah.
Versus, let's automate the system, and we're going to give them I'm just making this up as an example.
Sure.
We're going to automate the customer intake system, okay? And we're going to get their typical, what's their typical, they always call us. They call us once a week for the same exact thing, for the same exact equipment, and they usually prefer the same exact carrier. Why don't we just give them like a little, button they can press? They can go in the customer portal, press a little button, and then you can hear from your account manager, and they'll just give you a call and say like, hey, I saw you put this in, we're getting it ready. And it's like this nice, lovely, positive conversation, because you don't have to sit there and ask them the same 5 questions every week. Like, just little bitty things like that, they add up and they make the customer experience better. And that's really where I see a trend in how does the employee or the desk level fit in with all these technology changes. Well, just because things are getting automated doesn't mean that your role is going to go away. Your role is going to be more people faced. You're going to get back to working with people so that you don't have to deal with the minute, mundane, day-to-day manual data entry processes.
Yeah. That's something that you talked about at the beginning of this conversation, which is the user's perception that everything is bad about this new technology. So, they're kind of climbing up our butt. They're, looking at our location, they're tracking everything that we're doing. And it does feel, I can imagine it feels very intrusive. On the other hand, I think there are legitimate reasons for some of that. And many of them are truly designed to make it easier for the user, right? So there was a trucking company that I worked with one time, a transportation firm, that actually built geofencing into their application so that the users didn't have to acknowledge an arrival and a departure from a given site.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it does require location tracking be turned on to the applications in order to enable that, but it made the user experience like so much better for the software because the user could now just confirm something. They didn't have to remember to click the button, because in the past, if they forgot when they arrived at the depot, then their wait time at the depot wasn't being calculated correctly. If they didn't say, hey, we're here, hey, now I'm leaving, that time calculation that was so important in that scenario wasn't being done correctly because of user error. So in that case, it was an opportunity to improve the overall experience, but I know users can sometimes be put off with that. And I think that's what I think our role, all of us, as you said earlier, we all have a role as change managers in this process, is to help them understand what's in it for them.
Mm-hmm.
So that, it may still feel intrusive to some of them. But, most of the time, the men and women that are doing their jobs correctly and aren't trying to cheat the system in some way, I have found, tend to be very open to that, right? It seems to me, my observations have been that the men and women that are most concerned about that intrusiveness may have something to hide. But the others that I've spoken with firsthand recognize that most of those capabilities actually make their lives a little bit easier, and they can connect the dots to, I understand why the business would need this.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But as you said, we have a responsibility as the implementers and change managers to really communicate that to them and make sure that they understand that what's in it for them.
Yep, for sure. And, in some cases, there is a better option, and if someone figures out that better option, like geofencing, for example, then they're always going to say, no, I don't want your app. I don't want your app. I don't want my GPS turned on all the time. Like, sorry. It's just the little things that, are going to be an impact to businesses. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really, really fascinating conversation, and we're already coming up to the end of the time here. I was really excited to hear you connect the dots between a very heavy, science background, and yet, loop it around to the human impact and the empathy that, you bring to doing what you're doing today. So thank you for sharing that. I think it was a pretty unique perspective. I don't think I've heard before, but it actually makes just a ton of sense. And you've enlightened me, and I'm sure you have with the audience as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
Good. Well, I hope the audience has enjoyed this conversation as much as I had today. And if so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are out there innovating on the front lines. And this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. Visit the website at skillful.com. That's SKYLLFUL.com. And we're always looking for new guests on the show. So if you, the listeners, or you, the guest, Sarah, know somebody else that's out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story or their story. And we'd love to line them up as another guest on the show. So we'll see you on the next episode. And thanks again, Sarah, for joining us today.